Hey everybody, we're back with week 3 on our Effects on Violin series. We're going to be doing another week on EQ, and you're wondering, didn't we do EQ last week? We did, but I'll explain in a few minutes. It's all going to be cool, I promise. So in this series, the Effects on Violin series, what we're going to do is we'll hit a different effect each week. And for that effect, we will give general information. What is it? What does it do? What are some of the common parameters that we can control with that effect? What are some examples of the way string players would use this effect? And then a lot of weeks we'll have guest artists that come in and talk about how they use that effect in their work. It's really cool. I'm excited about this series and I can't wait to really dig into this. We're going to be here for a couple of months, so it's going to be fun. Week 1, we talked about gain structure. Not technically an effect, but if you don't get gain structure right, nothing that you do after that matters. So that's an important video. I hope you check that out. Week 2, we talked about EQ. I thought we were done, but we weren't. We talked about EQ. We talked about what it was, some of the different filters that you can use, what some of these frequencies sound like. We had guest artist Timothy Huh come in and explain that sometimes even things that you can't hear, the machines can hear. And if the electronics can hear a thing, then that could affect your overall sound, even if you don't think it will. So that's a very, very cool video that Timothy talked about. Some really good stuff in there. Definitely check that one out. However, we got some questions in the comments that make me think that maybe I didn't do a good enough job of explaining things, or I didn't go in depth enough on certain issues. So we'll just take another week. We'll do it. So this is a question that we got. Somebody thought, if it affects tone but not notes, or does it? If I cut the lows and mids, why don't my notes start sounding sharp? Not a bad question. If I boost the highs, will my E string become louder than my C string? So let's talk about these things. First of all, the word sharp has a different meaning to musicians than it does to non-musicians. For musicians, it has a very specific meaning, and it means we're talking about intonation. We're talking about a C natural, and a C sharp are two different notes. And maybe I'm playing a D. That D is a little sharp. It has nothing to do with the tonality of the note. It means that I'm out of tune. It means that I've come up too high on my A string with my third finger, and I need to fix that. So when we say sounding sharp, to us musicians, that has a very specific meaning, and it means intonation. When non-musicians hear something, you will hear this a lot of times. People say, oh, that sounded very sharp to me. And you're like, but his intonation was just fine. It hurt my ears because it sounded like somebody was stabbing me or cutting me. Oh, that's what you mean by sharp, like a knife. It's cutting me. So yeah, you say sharp. We wouldn't use that word. We would say stabby or piercing or shrill. We would use one of those words, but the word sharp in music has a very specific meaning, and we have to be careful that we don't mess that up. So this week, week 3, we will talk about understanding RTAs, real-time analyzers. We will talk about overtones and undertones. And that sort of brings up the concept of actual versus perceived loudness. And we're going to get into a lot of examples. I'm going to EQ some violin and cello sounds for you. This video could get kind of long, so just hang in there. Maybe grab a frosty beverage, find a comfortable chair to sit in. We're going to do some learning, all right? This is going to be fun. So what is an RTA? We talked about this a little bit last week. An RTA is a real-time analyzer. It is an extremely useful tool that allows us to visualize the things that we're hearing. Now, as a sound engineer, they always tell you to mix with your ears, not with your eyes, but then they give you a lot of lights and screens to look at. So yeah, those things are useful, and I do want to see things that's maybe going to help me train my ears to hear things so that I can mix with my ears later on because I've trained them to do a good job. Now, where do I find an RTA? Your front of house board, if it's a digital board, almost certainly has one. Your DAW, meaning any of the software that you use to record, if it's Logic or GarageBand or whatever. And then you can get it on a smartphone app. There are paid ones, which I have. There are some free ones that are pretty good. And yeah, they're great. They're super helpful. What is an RTA? An RTA is a thing that allows us to visualize frequency and amplitude. So what are the pitches that I'm hearing? That's on a left to right thing. Low notes will be down on this side. High notes will be on this side. And then the bars or the lines, the higher they get, the louder that specific frequency is. So it allows us in real time, because these bars and all this stuff will move. They're static on your screen right now, but we'll show you later if they're moving, that they are responding in real time. So this is a sine wave at 440 hertz. And if I were to run that up to 600 hertz, you would see the bars up here, they would start moving this way. The little line, the little spike line, you'd see it moving this way. So that's pitch. Higher pitches are this way, lower pitches are this way. And then loudness is up and quietness is down. All right. So the question is, if A is 440 hertz, when I play an open A on my violin, why doesn't it look like this? Because it doesn't look like this. So, and then you'll see the two bars on this RTA up here, the bar one. Why are there two bars if it's a sine wave? Because 440 hertz is between the center frequencies that each one of those bars are measuring. You can see the spike in the little line graph below. So that's just a little idiosyncrasy of using bar graphs to try to describe things that are spiky. That spike may actually kind of fall between where those two bars are measuring. I hope that makes sense. This is a sine wave, an A, just a ooh. And then this is what a violin looks like when you're playing an open A, and those don't look the same, right? Your ear can hear the difference between a computer playing a sine wave and a violin playing an A. So why can your ear hear the difference? Because there are other frequencies involved. Look at all those other frequencies in this violin A. You can see the fundamental with those two little bars poking up, and then you can see all those overtones, what we call overtones, up above that. Overtones create a unique sound for each instrument. It's why a piano and a trumpet and a viola and a violin all sound different even when they're playing the same note. And that's why your ear can tell the difference between each of those notes, besides the attack. Your ear can hear the difference between a piano and a violin because it can distinguish between those sets of overtones. Now, I want you to visualize these little red bars. And now imagine that each of those little frequency bands are a separate channel on a giant mixing console. That we could turn each one of those bars up or down. That's what EQ does. It doesn't allow us to move them side to side. We can't change the pitch, but we can change whether a given frequency or range of frequencies is louder or quieter. And that's all EQ does. So we often call it sculpting our tone when we're using EQ to sculpt our tone. It's a great analogy. Don't think of it so much as clay, although we might be able to use that as a different analogy. Think more like marble. I've got a big block of marble, and I'm going to chip away that marble to get to a statue of a naked guy, like the David or whatever. I'm going to get to a statue of that by chipping away the frequencies that I don't want. Now, I can't fundamentally change it. I can't change that block of marble into a block of wood. I can't make it bigger. I mean, I guess you could use Scotch tape to add things onto it, or duct tape or Flex Seal or something. But that's pushing the analogy too far. So we can't boost something that isn't there. My voice when I'm singing is a high, scratchy, thin voice. You can try boosting low frequencies all you want to turn me into Barry White. It's not going to work. I'm not generating any of those low frequencies. So trying to boost isn't going to do you any good, right? So we can't boost something that's not there. We can only cut things that are there. So we can't fundamentally change. So EQ is a very powerful tool, but it has its limits. So we're going to get into the example section here. I recorded a little line on a YEV electric violin. I'm going to loop that, and we're going to explore some EQ techniques. The very first thing you're going to notice as this thing starts going is at the bottom, there are a ton. So here's our RTA. At the bottom, there are a ton of low frequencies that you're going to see start popping here. And we'll see those moving. Those carry a ton of energy in them. And we don't want that. We don't want all that energy out there. So we're going to cut those out. And you'll see that it's not a brick wall. It's a roll-off. So let's start playing, and we're going to notice that, and I will run up I'll run up the high pass until it starts eating into the tone, and then we'll back it off a little. So I've already run my high pass up to well over 100 hertz. You really can't hear any difference yet, right? But that was a ton of energy that was being sent to the board, and the board's going to interpret that as signal, And the engineer's going to have to turn the gain down because you're going to be peaking him out. Once I make this change, he will be able to turn my violin up on the board, and it won't sound any different to you or to me, but the compressor will not be hitting it. Okay, so that's a good thing. Now I'm going to run this up really high to answer the question about will my E string be louder than my C string. I'm going to run this up really high, and you will notice that while you won't be able to hear that fundamental frequency of the C string anymore, you will still hear the overtones, and it's still going to be almost as loud as the E string. See, it just sounds like it's running through an AM radio, and some of you guys are old enough to know what that is. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pull a little shelf filter down here in some of these highs. And the thing, I'm going to run this frequency down until we hear it really making our sound kind of dull. And then we'll put it back kind of where we like it. So some of these things are personal choices. You may have liked it better with that low shelf off. That's fine. I think it does take a little bit of sort of the finger sort of rubbing thing, that real high texture. Some of that, you know, I feel like maybe that doesn't reproduce super well on certain PAs. It just sounds airy, or it sounds almost like static. So it will kind of make your sound maybe a little bit rounder. It will also make it a little less, it won't sound like there's like a hiss in it. That's the word I was looking for. All right, the next thing we do with electric violins is we're trying to get rid of some of that dreaded piezo quack that happens in this area right here, sort of in that 2 to 4K area. And we can get fairly aggressive here. So let's get that, and then we'll A-B it. And that's always the thing you want to do, is you want to A-B what you're hearing. Oh, yeah, I made it better. And then you shut it off and you go, oh, well, maybe I didn't. Okay. So we want to go back and forth a lot and make sure that we're actually hearing what we think we're hearing. All right, so I think that's probably a good example for there. Now let's give us a good start on violin, right? And again, some of these things are taste issues. You might like it better without some of these cuts. Maybe that cut was too much, whatever. That's where this becomes an art and not a science. Okay, now I've got another part here that I recorded on a 7-string violin. I don't play the cello, so let's look at some EQ here from a cello standpoint. Want to get that right for you guys. All right, so let's listen to some cello. The first thing, again, is we're going to notice a bunch of stuff in this low frequency range that we want to fix. And even with a cello that's super, super low frequency, remember that 20 to 40 hertz range carries so much power that we've got to get rid of some of that so that our compressor has a fighting chance of working for us. So I've probably cut almost half of the power that was going to be sucked up to reproduce that sound and didn't really change the tone much. So we definitely want to high pass even a cello, and that's a 7-string violin that goes even lower than a cello. So you still do want to high pass that a little bit. Now, one of the other things with a cello is that we may want to make that sound a little richer. So we may do a little bit of cutting right about here. Let's listen. I may not go quite that aggressive. And then the other thing, I may want to pull a really wide pull here just to get rid of some of that mid pressure that's in there. All right, so you may be thinking, gosh, you kind of pulled some of the fatness, like the whole push of that cello, you pulled some of that out. And yes, I did. And the reason I did that is to help this thing lay a little bit nicer in a mix. If that cello was playing all by itself, I might have left all that in there. But if it's in a mix and there's other instruments in there, that might be taking up space that other people need to fill. And that's why you got to think about context. If you are playing in a group of 10 other violinists, you're going to EQ your violin differently than if you're the only violin playing with like a bass player and a drummer. Or if you're playing unaccompanied violin, you would EQ differently than if you're playing in a band with a bunch of horns and stuff in it. So people are asking me, what's the right EQ setting? I don't know. It depends on so many things. It depends on the context that you're in. It depends on the group that you're in. It depends on the PA that you're running through. It depends on if it's cold outside. The temperature can affect these things. So you're not going to just pick an EQ setting and leave it there. You're going to make some adjustments, okay? Now, the next thing to talk about is loudness. You may have noticed that as we were doing those, as we're making those cuts, we're actually making things quieter. Yes, we are pulling signal strength out of this thing and we're making it quieter. Now, there is a difference between actual loudness and perceived loudness. And this has actual loudness is mathematical. Like when we pulled out a lot of those low frequencies, we didn't hear any difference. But the signal strength that is going to the front of house board is coming down quite a bit when we pull those low frequencies out. That's actual loudness. That's mathematical. And then perceived loudness is anatomical. There is a thing called the Fletcher-Munson curves, and it was named after two scientists. I bet you can't guess their names. So they came up with the idea that human hearing is not flat. We don't hear all frequencies equally well, and we don't hear all frequencies equally well. That is also a function of loudness. So the quieter something is, you can see this 20 phones, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time explaining these. There's all kinds of articles that you can read about this. But see, 20 phones is essentially 20 decibels at 1,000 hertz. So what they would do is they'd have somebody sit there and listen to a tone that's 1,000 hertz. Say, okay, That's the level. As I change this tone, I need you to move this fader to make it as loud, right? So as they're going down in frequency, you can see it that this 20 phones, as they start going down in frequency headed this way, that the volunteer had to move that fader up to make it sound the same level. Does that make sense? That's what this curve means. The curve, the line is the position where the person had to have the fader so it sounded like it was as loud as it was before. So you can see these curves actually flatten out as they get louder. But even then, there are some frequencies like around that 4,000, see where everybody's kind of dipped that fader down at around 4K. That is a frequency that we hear especially well. Incidentally, it's the key component in a baby cry. So yeah, there might be a reason that we can hear that really well. So we hear some frequencies better than others, and that's what makes them seem louder to us, even if they're not. So what is the reason that we're even talking about actual loudness versus perceived loudness? If I have two different settings on my board, say I've got my distortion tone and my clean tone, those are two different patches or tones that I'm using. It's frustrating when you kick on your distortion. It's like, oh my goodness, that's way too loud, or it's not loud enough. So I'm trying to make sure that these two sounds are the same loudness, but I've got to sort of balance between a perceived loudness, how does it sound to me, and how is it showing up on the board for the engineer? Because the engineer has ears and eyes, and they're having to use the meter on their board to tell them where to put their gain knob. And if I have something that doesn't sound any louder to me, but it actually is louder, it's going to be peaking out the board, and they're going to turn it down. So we've got to kind of find a balance between actual loudness and perceived loudness, and that can take a little time. We're not going to get super deep into that. I just wanted you to understand that because of the way we hear sound and the way that we EQ things, a distortion patch, because it has a lot of high frequency artifacts in it, we go back to this, we can hear high frequencies pretty well. Everybody had to dip their fader down because, oh yeah, that's pretty loud. Because we hear those high frequencies really well, it is going to have a high perceived loudness for us. So we may have to turn our distortion patches down a little bit so that the perceived loudness isn't so much more than of our clean tone. Okay, does that make sense? Now, one more thing before we go. We mentioned before about this overtone thing, that overtones make instruments sound the way they do. Could we use EQ as a tool to make a violin sound like a trumpet, or sound like a viola, or sound like a piano? Or could we use it to make an electric violin sound like an acoustic violin? The short answer is yes, we can to some extent. And that's actually called tone matching. You would need a 100 band or 1,000 band or 10,000 band EQ, but we have computers that could do that sort of thing. And it would have to be a very, very, very specific EQ. Well, that's a thing. And there are tools, the Tone Dexter, the Baggs Voice Print DI, there are custom IRs that can be made. And that is the thing that we're going to talk a little bit about next week. And we're going to have a special guest. Andrea Costa is going to be joining us from Italy. He's a guy who works a lot with IRs over there, and a company, D-Rap Sound, that makes custom IRs that they can listen to one instrument, listen to another instrument, calculate the mathematical difference between those, and then incorporate that difference into an IR that you can put into one of your sound processing devices. And I won't say that they could make a violin sound like bagpipes or something, because remember, EQ is not totally transformative. It's more of a sculpting tool. But you can absolutely make a YEV sound a whole lot like a Guarneri. And it's a thing that can be done. So we're going to be talking about that next week. That's a preview for the IR conversation that we're going to be having. And yeah, so I hope you learned a lot with this EQ thing. I tried not to get too deep into the weeds because we're here 20-some minutes already. But if you've got questions, you can put them in the comments section. And as always, mash that subscribe button. Watch a couple more of our videos, and we'll catch you guys next time for some talk about more effects.